Okay. So having dealt with that, I want to spend some time on this article by Abd al-Salam Faraj. And his article is called The Neglected Duty. Actually, it's a part of a brochure, a pamphlet, that he wrote prior to his activity in Egypt, which led to the assassination of President Anwar Sadat. Probably none of you remember this event because maybe you weren't even born yet, or if you were young. But Anwar Sadat was, a secular leader of Egypt, okay, and a very admired man who was trying to come up with some détente, some understanding with Israel, okay. And he was a lot of people's heroes. I don't know if that's more or less really a decent assessment of who he was or not, but I do remember that a lot of folks in this country admired Sadat for what he was trying to do. Well, Faraj and others were very negative, very critical of Sadat, and anybody like him who attempted to be a secular leader more than an Islamic leader, and anybody who was trying to have any sort of rapprochement with Israel or with the United States or any other country that was not Islamic, okay? And of course, Faraj comes from Egypt, and so, as you can see from this pamphlet, he wants to start at home. He wants to start where the closest enemy lies, and in his view, that enemy is the government of Egypt, and then more generally, other secular governments or governments that are not theocracies in the Middle East, okay? So, as your book points out, the thoughts in this pamphlet, in this section, are fairly representative of the types of thoughts that you might see from a group such as Al-Qaeda, which has become rather important to us. So it's a good read, and it really helps us to understand, but not all the way, because he uses terms that you may not be familiar with, and there's some historical background that you need. So first of all, we need to know what he's arguing against, because that's his position, is that he's against other Muslims, okay, who don't hold his view that jihad as a war is necessary, okay? So the first thing that he's against is the modern interpretation of the Koran, okay, that the Prophet Muhammad, when he calls for jihad, is not necessarily calling for a violent struggle, okay? Jihad means struggle. But modern Islamic theologians were beginning to say, well, jihad doesn't necessarily mean violence, okay? But it can mean the struggle against, against the infidel, against disbelief in other ways. And so there's that. And then also he's arguing against the idea that there can be a secular state, okay, and that is like a state that accommodates Islam but is not directly connected with Islam, more like the type of model of this country in which there's a legal separation between church and state. Okay, so he's against both of those things. All right. Now, let's deal with this notion that jihad can be something other than physical fight. Okay? Well, Islamic teaching does have four general ways that you can conduct jihad. Okay? The first way is in the heart. And that means that you can examine yourself, you can examine your life and the lives of those around you, and you can attempt to purify yourself and become more holy and more in accordance with Muhammad's teachings. And then there's the way of the tongue and the hand. And what that means is that in what you say to others and what you do to others, you should behave in ways that reflect Muhammad's teachings of generosity and kindness towards others, towards your fellow Muslims. Right? And then finally, there is the way of the sword, taking up arms against disbelievers. And that's what infidel means, someone who is a disbeliever. Okay? Somebody who has never believed in Islam. And Faraj makes a distinction between the infidel and the apostate. The apostate is somebody who is, an Islamic believer, but is somebody who has fallen away from the true teachings of Muhammad. Okay? All right, so given that, we know that there are other ways of, waging jihad. Okay? Faraj identifies several nonviolent ways and criticizes them. Right. The infidel is a person such as most of us would be, who have never, who never embraced Islam. Okay. Anybody of any other religion. Okay. And the apostate is somebody who believes in Islam, but has veered away from the true teaching as he sees it. Which one do you take the sword? Actually, both. Okay, both. You have an obligation, in his view, to destroy both. But actually, and I'll talk about this a little more in a minute, they're even worse. Okay, the apostate is more dangerous. Okay, in Christian lingo, that would be the heretic. The person who comes up with, unorthodox ideas and interpretations about the Bible. Right. So he would see people who don't teach correctly about Muhammad as he sees it. Okay? Well, he does identify several nonviolent ways, and you can see in his pamphlet here, he says, some say this, and some say this, and he attacks, each one of them as not necessarily untrue, but insufficient. Okay? So he acknowledges, for instance, that one way of waging jihad is to attack sin through self-examination and the attempt to be holy. He talks about encouraging an Islamic political party to help, inject Islam and Islam's agenda into the political process. He talks about encouraging the state to encourage acts of religiosity, okay, to, for instance, make people pay the zakat or tax, which supports the religious establishment. Talks about the use of nonviolent propaganda, and some people say that we only need to use nonviolent language and persuasion, and also that we can wage Islam or jihad by a greater knowledge of Islam among the faithful. That the problem is that too many people in the Islamic world don't understand their faith, so we need to educate them more. Well, anyway, to sum up his objection, okay, is that none of these are good enough. Not that they aren't useful, but they're not good enough. And the reason is because the Prophet Muhammad doesn't stop there. And he quotes Muhammad repeatedly, and his argument is Muhammad requires violent struggle. Okay, so he's obviously interpreting the Koran in a different way from some of these other people, right? Why are they good enough? Okay, because first of all, he says, all of these nonviolent proposals compromise with worldliness, with apostasy. Okay? And Muhammad, God, and obviously Muhammad, his prophet, would not wish for there to be any compromise. Okay? So anybody who simply buys into these, and some things are worse than others, like saying that there should be an Islamic party, is definitely a compromise with a liberal point of view, a liberal political point of view, that there should be multiple parties and they should compete for acceptance. Okay. Whereas other things are not as bad, using propaganda is not as bad, unless you preach nonviolence. Okay? Because for him, I hope it's very clear, violence is part of, your obligation as a Muslim. Okay. So there's this underlying theme in this work of the need for purity, the need not to compromise with worldliness, with a secular agenda, with moderate religious people who want to reinterpret the Koran or make new pronouncements and so forth. Okay. So, and he, as I said, he distinguishes between these two, but he says that the apostates should be treated more harshly because they have been taught the truth, but have decided to veer away from their true obligation. Okay, does that make sense? You blame somebody more if they have been taught the truth but have decided to reject part of it than somebody who may not even know the truth because they've never been taught it.
It's only his interpretation of their obligation, right?
Right, it's his interpretation. But he, of course, claims it's an absolute interpretation. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How's that pronounced?
Apostate.
Is that specific to the Islamic religion, or does that go with any sort of religion? Somebody that kind of veers away from it even though they've been taught it. Is that kind of
I think so. Yeah. I mean, the same concept as, I mentioned the word heretic, but I mean, in more general terms, it, even to this day, the person who has been taught Christianity and openly rejected it is going to be seen as a worse sinner than somebody who's, in Africa or China or someplace and has never even become acquainted with the teachings of Christ and so hasn't had a chance to accept or reject them. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty general attitude. Yeah.
In Christian theology, if someone is a non-believer or a pagan or something, some sections would at least want to go and educate them, not just destroy them. Mm-hmm. Does he even touch on that? I mean, he just seems like it's a struggle against hostile forces, but it also seems like he's also saying they don't know the right way. Mm-hmm. So does he ever address that?
Well, I think he by targeting these people more, I mean, he's saying we have to start here in the Mideast, in the Islamic world, which have veered away from the true faith. And these people need to be done away with because they are a great threat to faith, and they have made a conscious decision to break from it. Okay, whereas these people, we may be called upon to wage war against them, but we don't have to have the aim of destroying them. Obviously, some other people disagree with that, but that seems to be what he's saying in this pamphlet. Is that these people we will fight against, especially if they fight us. Okay, but we don't necessarily have to destroy them, and probably persuasion would be more amenable to them. But these people we have to destroy. Okay, very clearly, he says we have to start with the enemy that's close at hand. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I think so. I mean, the general philosophy of getting rid of those governments and doing whatever it takes, and certainly, seeing those governments and those types of people as more of an enemy than the infidel. I mean, the infidel is somebody that you eventually want to conquer and change his faith, not necessarily destroy.
Right.
Yeah, right. So it would stand to reason that you could compromise with your principles, and you could either do one of two things. You could make an alliance with the infidel, or you could attempt to drive, the infidel out and attempt to isolate.
Time they've done one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, Muhammad, among other things, he taught, but he also conquered, and he taught conquering too. So during his lifetime, territory in the Middle East was conquered, and then after his lifetime, immediately after, a great deal more territory was conquered. But, I mean, in his teachings as well as in his actions, it's clear that it was okay and good to, conquer territory in the name of God, to create converts. Mm-hmm.
And didn't that start mostly when the people that he began preaching to, they didn't accept his teachings, and then he went back and I don't know if Jihad originated there, but I remember that it came about, the idea of violent attacks developed later in his theology person, I believe. I don't think it was immediately apparent. If I remember correctly, I don't know.
You're right. It developed as he moved on. The first thing that happened to Muhammad is he started having visions and revelations from God, and then he started to write some of those out, relay them to others. Some of them got written down. Not all of them had to do with jihad, but as time went by, his notion that you need to conquer by the sword if God's will is not accepted became a bigger theme. Mm-hmm.
Well, also the issue of succession after Muhammad's death further compounded the problem. As you know, there's this big rift between who would lead the Muslim faith, and that just further embedded that the divisions that would increase the amount of violence overall. Yeah,
the Sunnis and the Shiites, right? Certainly, it became more politicized, but I mean, honestly speaking, there's, a lot of rhetoric today about the nature of Islam and whether it's peaceful or violent. And the truth is, there's plenty of stuff in the Koran that would lead you to think that, violent conquest of the infidel and of the outside is okay, And that's proven by the fact that he can pull this and that quote out and do that. Now, just like the Bible, there's lots of ways that such a large work can be interpreted, and different themes can be emphasized over others. And more moderate, people in the Islamic world tend to choose a different way of interpreting or different things to emphasize. But, truly, we can't say that Muhammad's teachings were, say, pacifist or, would disapprove of that concept of jihad. Not at all. Anyway, so Faraj argues that the problem with those who do not believe or who have fallen away and propose these other more peaceful means is that they miss the clear call to arms of Muhammad. Okay, so he repeatedly quotes Muhammad. And that seems to be his main strategy for convincing believers, which is totally understandable. Okay, and I'll just pull out one, but they run throughout this piece. He says on page 466 of Muhammad, the Apostle Muhammad says, "I have been sent with a sword at this hour, so that God alone is worshipped, without associate to Him. He put my daily bread under the shadow of my lance. He brings lowness and smallness to those who disagree with what I command. Whosoever resembles a certain group of people will be counted as a member of that group." So he says, unless Muslims at least accept the obligation to take up arms under certain circumstances, they have fallen away. They are rejecting the true faith. And then he lists 3 times in which an individual has a duty to take up arms. Okay? One, he says, is when 2 armies meet. That is, when there is a battle has been joined between Islamic forces and those that are their enemies. And it is forbidden to run away or to object. Okay? 2, when the infidels attack, there is an obligation for every Muslim to fight. And 3, when the imam, who is the spiritual leader, like a priest, calls upon people to fight. Okay. Now the article here doesn't say, I don't think it says anywhere here if he's a Shiite or a Sunni, but I would assume that he's a Shiite Muslim because they place more emphasis on that, this direct spiritual authority of the imams and the religious leaders to make orders, to tell people what they have an obligation to do. Okay. Now another thing that he mentions the return of the Caliphate. Okay. And you may have been a little confused about what that meant. What that refers to is that that rule that Muhammad established, that political rule, which he established and then passed on to future leaders. Okay, and you mentioned there's a dispute over who the power should have passed to. Okay, and the Shiites think it should have been his son-in-law, and it turned out to be a succession of 4 other people that didn't reflect that line. And so right from the start there was this division. But it refers to the political rule that started around 630 or so, or 632, when Muhammad died, and extended all the way to 1257. Okay. And that political rule encompassed much of the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain, and some of Western Asia. Okay. It was expanded, as time went by until it reached that extent. All right. Egypt, where Faraj is mostly concerned with, was conquered in 645. Okay. And it continued with its caliphate until actually it was completely eliminated in 1517. After the Mongols attacked Baghdad in 1258, the caliphate came to an end, okay, in any practical sense. But the caliph was then established in Egypt and continued as a sort of, rather marginal figure until 1517. So basically, he's looking at all this history and saying, we need to reestablish the Caliphate, first in Egypt, and then we need to, spread that rule again. That's his ideal, the way things used to be. The golden age of Islam, in his view, is that age in which there was the political rule, the theocratic political rule over those people, and then eventually to spread beyond that. Let's see. A little bit about Muhammad. Muhammad died in Medina. He spent quite a bit of time in Mecca. Mecca became the holiest city of Islam, and Mecca is in Saudi Arabia. And it's because of that, because that's where he established his own power base, his own rule, that Muslims still reverence Mecca, still make pilgrimages to Mecca, pray in the direction of Mecca, and so forth. Muhammad received revelations directly from God. And that's what he believed. And this was the God of the Jews and the Christians, whom he called Allah. But he believed, unlike many of the people in his area at that time, that there were not many gods, but there was only one God, and that it was the God of the Jews and the Christians. But that he was receiving additional revelation, that he was the latest and last prophet. And Muslims came to believe that he was the last and definitive prophet. As I said, he died in 632, and about 650, his writings and his retellings of his revelations, which he received orally, were written down in what now is the Koran. All right? So the Koran is perceived by most of the Islamic world as the direct voice of God. In other words, that Muhammad was the cipher or the conduit through which God spoke to man. So when you're reading the Koran, you're reading the words of God directly, and so anything in there is a serious truth and a direct obligation. All right. So, because I know that some of you don't know much about Islam, I would urge you to learn more about it, obviously. And I'll be teaching a religion and politics class next fall, and I hope to spend probably at least a third, if not half of the time on Islam, because we need to know more about it. Okay? All right. And we should have spent more time on it in this class. There's just so much to talk about. It's unbelievable. Anyway, are there any questions about it, about what we just discussed? Any more?